to specifically talk about one area, which is something that I don't think we focus on a lot of, and that relates to differentiation of content. But before I get into that, I want to take a minute to review with you the differentiation model. I'm going to focus for now on the top. The bottom part is important too. We do have to understand how ready our students are. For example, you teach preschool. You're not going to be teaching them, algebraic formations, right? Formulations. There's no way. They're not ready. So we need to know the maturity of our students. We need to know the background information. Depending on what you're teaching, right, you need to know that they have the core skills that you need in order to be able to teach this. But for now, we're going to focus on these three, and I'll come back to content in a minute. Differentiating the content means, what am I actually giving them for them to learn? Okay, and you might think, well, I'm just going to teach, the psukim, or I'm just going to teach this concept. Maybe yes, maybe no. We'll talk about it. The process is the means by which I do it. So this is what we call the standard frontal instruction, right? I'm here as the proverbial sage on the stage, and I am unilaterally sharing my wisdom with you. Probably we do that most of the time. The teacher's in the front of the room, we lecture. Especially, maybe not so much with the younger grades, but as the children get older, we typically default into that approach quite a bit. So other approaches, which again is not really our topic, might be cooperative learning, might be independent learning, might be other forms of instruction where the children are accessing information in different ways. That's differentiation of process. And then finally, we have differentiation of product. What is the end goal? What is the outcome? What am I ultimately expecting my students to do that demonstrates that they've learned what I asked them to learn? It sounds so fundamental, but so often we forget about it. We need to know, what is our objective? What do we want the students to master? And what is the evidence that the students will use, or that we will use, to demonstrate mastery? So I'm guessing, if most of you are like me, you would say a test is probably the way that you would collect your evidence, your data. I'm not going to get into testing right now. It's a topic that deserves attention. But there are other ways by which we collect that information. And we're going to talk about some of them. Does anyone here have a thought about another way other than a test by which to determine that students have learned? Please. Okay. Beautiful. Reports. Excellent. Right. Those are much more creative too. And we talked about modalities before. They do tap into those. Any others?
Just asking questions in class.
You're getting feedback? And some people you might be familiar with the portfolio approach, where the evidence is ongoing. So instead of having this almighty, maybe I'll use the term summative, it's not really summative. Summative test would be the very end of the year, sort of like the standardized tests that we might give, the final exam. But we often use that test to determine a lot about how a student is performing in our class. So again, it's really a conversation on its own merits. Like, how do I assess my student? What are my benchmarks? What am I looking for? But all of that really does fit into the bigger picture of differentiation. And what it means is that I'm taking into account the modalities, the interests, the abilities, and the nuances of each individual student as best I can in order to make sure that he or she is learning effectively. Now, I know that this is an overwhelming concept. I'm not here to sell differentiation on you. I think deep down we all realize that all of us are different. I can just say that for now. We all realize everyone is different. How much we're able and prepared to do to get to all of that, that's usually a conversation between you and your administrator. So I stay out of those. But I do think it's at least important to understand what we're talking about, because everybody in this room can do a lot of what we're going to discuss today, specifically with how we engage our students, and more importantly, how we know that they're learning what we're teaching. In research, I'm in a program right now where you need to be able to do a lot of research, and there's something called Pearson's correlation test. If you're familiar with it, if anyone's been on a doctoral level type researching, et cetera, you know that we often measure what is the relationship between this and this. So for example, I want my student to perform well on a test. What is the relationship between studying for a test and performing well on a test? Right? If it's a perfect correlation, meaning the more I study, the better I do. That's called a perfect one. If it's an absolute reverse correlation, because the more I study, the less well I do, which of course doesn't sound right, but let's just say for argument's sake, that's a correlation of -1. Most things correlate somewhere in between. So I talk to teachers often about what is the relationship between teaching and learning. And let's not delude ourselves and think that it's a perfect one. It often depends. It depends on what we're teaching. It depends on how we're teaching it. Right? Just because we said it doesn't necessarily mean they got it. And making sure that we continually check on our content to ensure that they're there, that's an important process. Any teacher, I think you all know this, but I feel compelled to say it anyway. Any of us who wait for the test to determine how the student is performing are doing ourselves and our students a grave injustice. Meaning to say, if I've gone 2 weeks and I have no clue as to how Hani is processing the information that I've been teaching, then I am doing everybody a disservice, because that's not what good teaching is. Good teaching is constantly looking for and getting feedback. The test, in my mind, should almost be perfunctory. But if we are really with our students, we should have a good handle on how they're performing. And you may choose not to test, or you may choose to make the test worth less, or you may choose other strategies because you are so in tune with how your children are performing. So, when it comes to differentiating the content, one thing that's really important is to try to know what they know. So let's use an example. I'll jump right into this one. I think this is one of the best graphic organizers out there. You're going to get a packet from me of graphic organizers in a little bit. There are all sorts of goodies in it, and hopefully you will enjoy using them in your classroom if you don't already. KWL, it's right here on the screen. What do I know? What do I want to know? And what have I learned? Keeping in mind that the last column gets completed later. What have I learned is, what have I learned at the end of this unit? Or at the end of this day, or at the end of this class, whatever it might be. Okay? Depending on the child, they might be able to fill it on their own. Maybe you have to write it down for them. But you have it. The reason I'm mentioning the KWL in part is because this could give you good information about what it is your students already know. All I'm saying is that you want to feel validated. You want to feel that your time is well utilized. Even the kids who are troublemakers, so to speak, even the ones who enjoy mixing it up a little bit, deep down they all want to feel that their time in class was well utilized. Nobody wants to feel that they wasted 40 minutes. Maybe once or twice to come home, we had this kind of thing. But on a daily basis, that every time I go into so-and-so's class, I know this already, I don't have to learn this, right? That type of thing. So in your own mind's eye, because we didn't get a chance to discuss it, if you can think about in your class, what are some of those skills and what is some of that content that oftentimes you find your children already know? Or where are the gaps that you have been repeatedly surprised that they should know it and they don't? This might become part of a bigger conversation in terms of your scope and sequence and how your curriculum aligns. That's not for now, but this is good information for you to know. And if you use something like a KWL, whether you present it orally or you present it in writing, you give them small group time, you ask them to work on it independently, that's all process, that's all your choice. But you're getting good feedback about what is the content I really want to focus on. So we talked about some kind of pre-assessment or KWL. Now the ideal time frame for this is a few weeks before you start. Okay, that's the ideal planning. Not always so easy to do, but the more that we can plan ahead, the more that we can get that information ahead of time, the better off we will be and the more focused our instruction will be. Again, we all have very limited dual curriculum with a lot of expectations, a lot of demands. The more focused and optimized we can make that learning process, the better it'll be for everybody. Okay? Now, it also might inform how we choose to organize our students. Now, normally, we do the same thing for everybody. Either whole class instruction, or everybody gets into a jigsaw. However we do it for everybody. Maybe yes, maybe no. Now, you might choose, for example, to work with a handful of students in a small group over here, and you might put other students in other groupings. You'll know that often by engaging with them and sort of getting some feedback about how they learn best. and you may choose on occasion to mix it up a little bit. So you're differentiating not only what you're teaching, but the method by which they're absorbing that information. Okay, so it's how to identify the content, and of course, how to identify getting the content into my students' minds so that they're processing it and learning it. Okay, so TAPS, here you have the reference. Now, just in case, normally speaking, this doesn't mean that I'm teaching totally different things to different students. That's not what differentiating the content is about. It's usually more subtle than that, as we will talk about. Occasionally, if you have a child that really knows much more or has severe deficits, you're going to have to deal with that. That's not so simple. And maybe that's more than you can handle alone. Maybe that's where you talk to your administrator about getting some kind of support to get this child caught up. You can identify what are the materials that are available to you. It could be something to listen to, something to watch, depending on the school and what's considered appropriate, something to read. And in many cases, it might be the same thing, just on a different level of the taxonomy. So if you look at number 2 on your sheet, it doesn't, the language or the words are a little bit hard to see because it's sort of black on black. But you'll notice moving from the base up, you'll have, this is the original version of Bloom's taxonomy. There is a more, so to speak, updated version. It's similar, but not exactly the same. We'll use the original for now, because that might be what many of you are more familiar with. And understanding that we can engage students on the very basic levels of the taxonomy, or we can engage them on a higher level. And that's important for us to keep in mind. A lot of what we do as teachers is on the knowledge and comprehension level. I would guess that when you prepare your test, almost all of it is what we call, forgive the terminology, spitback, right? What does Rashi say about this? Well, tell me, what is the Pythagorean theorem? Whatever those are, just write that. Okay? Basic knowledge, and maybe a little bit of comprehension. There isn't that much once we get into that middle, and certainly that upper level of the taxonomy. In fact, if you talk about good test preparation or creation, a test really should be designed from the beginning of the unit, and should have in it various aspects of the taxonomy. So it's not just, I ask you a smattering of questions from 20 different, let's call it subsections within this unit. So I have 20 questions, 20 subsections, I sort of covered everything. That's not really what good test design is like. Yes, it certainly needs to cover or be representative of different aspects of what I taught, but don't you want to see evidence of real learning? Don't you want to see evidence of application? Don't you want to see evidence of analysis? And the ability to synthesize and maybe even to evaluate. So if you're cognizant of the taxonomy, you may have children in your class that need to be here. They don't have the knowledge. They're stuck on the basics. They need to review again those 10 words, those 20 pieces of information, whatever that is. They're there. And you need to keep them there because you can't, we all know what a pyramid would look like if the foundation is not solid. But you have students who are walking in, either know it beforehand or master it within 5 minutes. So what are you going to do with them? So now you're prepared with analysis. And then you move them to a higher level. So you're not being asked to change the lesson fundamentally. The content might be the same, but you might direct them to a certain commentator that they otherwise wouldn't see. Or maybe you're giving them an opportunity to engage with this lesson, this math lesson, on a deeper level, maybe using a computer or something like that to go to a higher level that maybe you can't do with the rest of your class. And you only know that because you've been getting that feedback and you've been evaluating as you go. Any questions or comments? So this is really a depth issue, right? Oftentimes we think of breadth, but you have the ability to go very deep if you want to. And many of your children would really like that from you. And I think we have to realize, what is it like to be in their shoes? Right? One of the great things about being in a workshop like this is you get to be feeling like what your students deal with every single day. And you sort of change your seats and you feel like you can't go anywhere without raising your hand and asking permission. And you're living that experience again. And that can be helpful every now and again. But the reason I mention it is because we also have to remember, how do we learn best? And maybe I'm entertaining today, I'm not sure. Maybe the content I presented to you is pretty decent, hopefully. right? But at the end of the day, I know there are people in this room who are more engaged with what I'm doing right now, and some people are having a harder time, because I haven't done all of the things I possibly could do to speak to you, how you learn, and on the level where you find yourself. So the more you can sort of put yourself into the mind of the learner and prepare yourself, a lot of this preparation, the good news is that if your curriculum is pretty steady year over year, you can deepen a little bit at a time. You don't have to bite off more than you can chew. You can take a few pieces, you can see what your colleagues already have, you can go online and find other materials. It often doesn't take much, but it takes a mindset. It takes a thought process, and it takes a willingness to ask the question, what do you know? What have you not yet mastered? And how can I now go ahead and help you? Because if I keep running and you're still here, I have lost you for the rest of this unit. And maybe I'll pick you up again over here when I start the next unit. But if it's math or some other subject, which is typically developmental and builds one to the next, if I've lost you here, I'm never getting you back unless I catch you up here. And the longer it takes for me to find that out, the farther away I am at that point, and we all understand where this is going. So these are important considerations to keep in mind.